Louis McCoy didn't buy the boat to show off or prove anything. It wasn't a statement piece or a nod to some long-forgotten dream. It was, in his words, a project, a reason to keep my hands dirty and my head clear. The boat was older than some of the houses in the neighborhood, sun-faded fiberglass, scratches on the hull, teak railing that had turned gray with time. It had character, history etched into every bolt, and the kind of imperfections that only made it more interesting to someone like Louis. He towed it onto his property one Saturday morning, backed it carefully into the crushed stone parking strip beside his house, threw a tarp over the top, and began to imagine what he might make of it over the next few months. He had no illusions about time or perfection. It would be slow work. He was good with slow work. The neighborhood, on the other hand, moved fast and stiff. There was always someone painting shutters or replacing their lawn with synthetic turf. Cars were washed at 7 a.m. sharp. Garbage bins stood in military formation on pickup days. Everything here gleamed like it was being staged for a brochure. That didn't bother Louis much. He wasn't against order or beauty. He just didn't see the need for a place to look like a retirement magazine ad 24/7. His own house, while tidy and well-kept, carried his signature. Earth tones, tall ornamental grasses, and a wind chime on the porch that clinked like soft spoons in the breeze. No one ever complained until the boat showed up. The first time he met Karen Holbridge in person, she stood with one foot on his gravel, the other balanced awkwardly on the curb, her latte in one hand and a laminated packet in the other. She was exactly what people meant when they used her first name as a descriptor. Mid-50s. Large, tightly wound in stretchy beige clothing with a jaw set like stone and a voice that had clearly spent years finding reasons to complain. She didn't greet him. She simply extended the packet toward him like it was a subpoena. "Louis, is it?" she said, eyes darting toward the tarp-covered boat. "We need to talk about the visual cohesion of our community." Louis, who had been loading tools back into his shed, wiped his hands and took the papers without looking at them. "Can I help you with something?" Karen's eyes narrowed like she was disappointed he hadn't already apologized. "This," she gestured toward the boat like she was pointing out a dead animal, "isn't in line with the design standards we've worked very hard to maintain here. Our homes are high value, and we take that seriously. The presence of aged watercraft doesn't reflect the tone of the street." Louis didn't smile. He didn't argue. He simply said, "It's on my land." "Yes," Karen replied slowly, drawing the word out like she was speaking to someone hard of hearing. "But it's within the visible spectrum of shared visual space. That means it affects others." Louis glanced at the papers she'd handed him. They weren't official documents, just a stapled printout of Neighborhood Standards and Aesthetic Guidelines, typed in Comic Sans and obviously compiled by a group of people with too much time and too many opinions. "Is this enforceable?" he asked. Karen raised her eyebrows, surprised by the question. "This community has always prided itself on mutual respect and neighborly compromise. Surely you wouldn't want to be the one to disturb that balance." He handed the papers back. "My boat stays. Thank you for your concern." Karen stared at him for a long moment, her nostrils flaring. She didn't take the papers. "If it's still here by next weekend, we'll be filing a formal complaint." Louis went back to his tools. Over the next few days, he noticed subtle changes in the way his neighbors behaved. The man across the street, Todd something, stopped waving when he pulled out of his driveway. The kids on their bikes no longer took the shortcut across his yard, as if the boat itself had emitted some kind of invisible boundary. He wasn't offended. He was used to people pulling away when something didn't fit their version of pretty. Then came the signs. On Monday, a small whiteboard was staked into the grass near the edge of his property. "All vehicles must be kept in garage when not in use." It read in red dry erase marker. No name, no signature. Louis didn't touch it. By the end of the day, it was gone. 2 days later, someone left a typed letter in his mailbox with no return address. Our community relies on mutual adherence to visual standards, it began. Please consider relocating your vessel to a facility that is better equipped to store such items. The phrase, your vessel, made Louis laugh out loud. The real escalation came Thursday, when he discovered that someone had scrawled a crude arrow in chalk on the road pointing toward his boat, with the words, Neighborhood Eyesore, written beside it. He washed it off with a hose, not angry, just vaguely amused at how petty things had become. But petty things, he knew, had a way of growing teeth. Friday evening, his 13-year-old nephew Aaron came home from school quiet and sullen. Louis didn't ask what was wrong right away. He waited, letting the kid settle. They made dinner together, chili and cornbread, and sat on the porch eating in silence. Only after they'd cleared their plates did Aaron finally speak. Some lady came to school today, he said she was part of a community outreach committee. She told Principal Davis that your boat sends the wrong message about the neighborhood's values. Then she gave us flyers for a weekend cleanup event and asked if we'd like to be the change we want to see. Everyone knew she was talking about our house. Louis exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Did you say anything? Aaron shook his head. Didn't need to. People were already whispering. Louis didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse or launch into a rant. He just nodded, stood up from his chair, and walked around the side of the house to where the boat sat under its tarp. He stood there for a long time, arms crossed, thinking not about revenge or rebellion, but about balance, about how much silence is healthy, and when it becomes a way to let people walk all over you. He thought about the line between being a good neighbor and being a pushover. And he made a decision. The next morning, well before sunrise, Louis hitched the trailer to his truck. He didn't wake Aaron. He didn't make a show of it. He drove slowly through the still-sleeping neighborhood, turned onto the main loop, and backed the boat carefully into the paved turnaround directly in front of the community clubhouse, the same building where Karen held her meetings and tea socials, and bake sale planning sessions. The trailer fit neatly between the two flagstone planters. He unhitched it, secured the wheel locks, and climbed a small ladder he'd brought along. On the side of the boat, in thick black paint, he wrote 4 words in a careful hand. The HOA Eyesore. Then he left. No announcements, no social media posts, no confrontation. By the time the neighborhood began to wake up, the sun was rising in a clear blue sky, and the boat was sitting proudly in front of the building most sacred to Karen and her minions. The lettering gleamed in the light like a dare. Louis was back at home by then, pouring coffee, buttering toast, and feeling, for the first time in weeks, like he could breathe. He wasn't starting a war. He was returning the favor. The boat's presence in front of the clubhouse didn't cause a stir right away. At first, there was only silence, the kind of tight-lipped neighborhood silence that spoke louder than any complaint ever could. Nobody came to Louis's door. No one called. The group chat stayed unusually quiet, like a storm building behind the sky. But by mid-morning, the first ripple came. Todd, the guy across the street who once lent Louis a socket wrench with a smile, was now pacing his driveway on his phone, clearly agitated, throwing furtive glances toward the clubhouse as if the boat might explode. Later that afternoon, an email went out to the neighborhood listserv. Subject line: Urgent. Unpermitted vehicle blocking. Access to clubhouse. The body of the message, unsigned but obviously ghostwritten by someone with a tendency for uppercase emphasis, described a large, unsightly vessel that had been illegally parked, disrupting scheduled community activities and potentially endangering our property value. Louis read the message without reaction, then deleted it. The clubhouse wasn't booked for anything that weekend. He knew because he'd called and asked the week before, pretending to be someone interested in hosting a fundraiser. "You're good to go through Monday," the girl on the phone had said cheerfully, tapping away at her keyboard. "Looks like no one's reserved the space since that brunch meeting last weekend." "Should be fine." So, when the accusations began that he was disrupting community use, that children couldn't access their after-school crafts club, that yoga sessions had to be canceled, he knew it was noise, meant to frame his actions as hostile rather than what they truly were, a mirrored reflection of the treatment he'd received. Still, Louis didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had parked legally within the bounds of municipal guidelines and even double-checked the setback measurements from the curb. The trailer had its registration current. The boat wasn't leaking fluids or debris. It wasn't a wreck, it was just inconveniently honest. By Sunday morning, a new sign had appeared beside the boat, planted crookedly in the flower bed like someone had done it in a hurry. No parking. Private property. Subject to tow. It wasn't city-issued. It had been printed on foam board and zip-tied to a metal stake, the kind you'd find at a hardware store. The font was different from official notices, and the word private was misspelled. Louis chuckled when he saw it, snapped a picture with his phone, and texted it to Aaron with the caption, "Spelling still matters." But he didn't remove the sign. He left it there, crooked and cheap, because it served as evidence, not just of pettiness, but of how quickly those who preach order will abandon it when challenged. On Monday morning, the real fallout began. Louis received a letter hand-delivered by someone in a reflective vest who didn't make eye contact. The envelope bore the city's logo, but the return address was that of a subcontracted municipal compliance office, one of those semi-private firms used by local governments to outsource minor enforcement tasks. Yeah, the letter was firm, not hostile, but it cited a formal complaint regarding unapproved parking of a marine vehicle on common-use grounds and stated that an investigation was pending. Louis wasn't surprised. He called the number listed, asked for clarification, and got a bored voice on the other end saying, "We're required to follow up on any complaints filed with proper documentation. You'll be contacted after inspection." Still no mention of who filed it, of course, but Louis could practically hear the sweat in Karen's palm as she sent it through. That night, Aaron asked if they were in trouble. Louis told him no, not really, but the boy didn't look convinced. He kept watching the front window as if expecting a squad car to pull into the driveway and drag the boat away like a stolen artifact. "It's not about the boat," Louis finally said, stirring his tea slowly. "It's about what it represents to them. They like everything to match. They like symmetry, control. You park something that doesn't fit, they panic like it's an infection." Aaron considered that. "But it's just a boat." "Exactly," Louis said. "And that's the problem." The following day, Louis received a second notice, this time from the property management group that oversaw landscape maintenance and general services in the neighborhood. It claimed that his lawn was non-compliant, citing vegetative inconsistency and presence of unapproved decorative objects. The unapproved object, of course, was the boat, though it sat on gravel, not grass. When he called to ask for clarification, he was placed on hold for 15 minutes and then told, "All complaints are reviewed by committee. If you'd like to dispute the findings, you may submit a written request with photographs to be reviewed within 60 business days." 60 days. Louis hung up without a word. He began taking photographs that evening, not just of his boat, but of the entire neighborhood. The plastic flamingos in Judy's yard 2 doors down, the cracked bird bath behind the Pattersons' bushes, the rusting basketball hoop leaning sideways in the Miller driveway. He wasn't doing it to build a case. He was doing it to remind himself that hypocrisy always hid in plain sight. But Karen wasn't backing down. On Wednesday, a local tow truck appeared in front of the clubhouse just before dawn. Louis was already up. He watched from across the street, hands in his jacket pockets as the driver circled the boat, looked confused, made a call, and then left without touching it. A few hours later, Louis received another letter, this one from a local attorney claiming to represent the Community Standards Alliance. It was written in formal but vague language, warning that continued occupation of shared space by unsanctioned vehicles could lead to civil action, It didn't list statutes. It didn't cite municipal codes. It relied entirely on tone, designed to frighten or at least intimidate. Louis scanned it once and forwarded it to a lawyer he knew, someone who had once helped him navigate a boundary dispute years ago. She replied within the hour. Sounds like amateur bullying. Nothing enforceable here. But keep every letter, everything in writing. He did. By Friday, the tension in the neighborhood was heavy enough to feel in the air. Nobody waved anymore. Conversations at the mailboxes were quiet, clipped. Aaron got bumped in the hallway at school and heard the word trailer trash muttered under someone's breath. At the grocery store, Louis caught someone staring at him with the kind of smirk that said they thought they knew the whole story. He didn't lash out. He simply paid for his groceries, walked out with his head high, and reminded himself that this was exactly why he had never tried to blend in. That night, he noticed that someone had scattered mulch all around the base of the boat trailer. Not city mulch. Something store-bought, artificially red, meant to look decorative. It was a passive-aggressive landscaping maneuver, an attempt to frame the boat as part of a greater disorder, something wild and untended that needed to be buried. Louis didn't remove it. He raked it into a perfect circle instead and left it that way, like a pedestal. On Saturday, he got a knock at the door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was a man in a navy blazer and khakis, mid-30s with a clipboard tucked under his arm and an expression that tried to be neutral but couldn't quite hide the discomfort. "Mr. McCoy," the man began, "I've been asked to speak with you informally before any further action is taken. There's been considerable concern among the residents about the optics of your vessel placement." Louis stared at him. "Optics," he repeated. The man cleared his throat. "We understand you're within your rights in a narrow sense, but this isn't about legality. It's about community cohesion, perception, and goodwill." Louis let the silence hang long enough that the man shifted uncomfortably on the porch. Finally, he said, "When people start using words like optics, it's usually because they can't use the law. Sir, we're just trying to avoid further escalation. A compromise might be in everyone's best interest." Louis nodded. "I agree." The man's eyes lit up, briefly. "I'll move the boat when Karen apologizes for the graffiti, the fake citations, the school stunt, and the mulch." The man blinked. I'm not authorized." "I know," Louis said. "You're just the guy with the clipboard." And he closed the door. That night, someone slashed the tires on the trailer. Not dramatically, just enough to make it sag, to turn it into an eyesore in truth. Louis stood in front of it for a long time, looking not at the damage but at the empty clubhouse behind it, with its too clean facade and closed doors. The boat wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The damage to the trailer wasn't catastrophic, but it was deliberate, and Louis knew it. One tire had been cleanly punctured with something narrow and sharp, likely an awl or a long nail. Not a random nail on the road, not some accident of coincidence. This was a message disguised as inconvenience. When he bent down to inspect the sagging wheel, he noticed boot prints in the mulch someone had scattered days earlier. The prints were fresh, deep in the still damp wood chips, leading in from the direction of the sidewalk and retreating the same way. No attempt to cover them. Whoever had done it wasn't afraid of being seen. That told him more than enough. Louis didn't say anything that morning, didn't shout or pace or call the cops in a fit. Instead, he drove to the nearest tire shop, picked up a pair of replacements, and spent the afternoon replacing both wheels himself. He didn't want to just patch what had been slashed. He wanted it better than before. It wasn't just maintenance, it was refusal. Word must have spread quickly that the sabotage hadn't worked, because by the next morning, he received another envelope. This one wasn't a complaint or a threat of civil action, it was an invitation, an official-looking document printed on heavy paper with a faux gold letterhead that read, "Community Standards Advisory Panel, Special Session." It claimed to be a forum for mutual understanding and conflict resolution. and stated that he was formally invited to present his position regarding continued non-compliant activity involving storage of marine vehicles in shared access zones. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, in the same clubhouse parking lot where the boat still sat just feet from the entrance. Lewis read the invitation 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it in his desk drawer. He already knew what it was, a public dressing down disguised as diplomacy. A staged tribunal. They weren't interested in hearing him out. They were hoping he'd finally crack under the pressure of collective disapproval. That was their mistake. They assumed he needed their approval in the first place. When Thursday came, Lewis dressed plainly, dark jeans, button-down shirt, clean work boots. He didn't rehearse a speech. He didn't carry documents or photographs. He arrived 10 minutes early, leaned against the fender of the boat, and waited. Slowly, neighbors began to arrive, folding chairs in hand, like it was some sort of potluck theater. A small PA system was set up at the edge of the parking lot. Karen appeared, of course, flanked by her 2 ever-present friends, Marla with the pearl earrings and Diane with the oversized sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped below the rooftops. Karen wore a lavender blouse that strained at the seams and a clipboard held flat against her stomach like armor. She didn't look at Louis as she passed. The crowd grew to around 30 people, mostly the same faces that had stopped waving over the past few weeks. They murmured in low tones, casting side-eyes toward the boat like it might spring to life and grow tentacles. The meeting opened with a speech, not from Karen, but from a younger man who identified himself as the moderator. He read from a prepared statement about community integrity, collective responsibility, and the importance of preserving property value through visual harmony. Lewis listened, stone-faced. When his name was called, he stepped forward without fanfare. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't pace, he simply said what needed to be said. I own the trailer. I parked it within city code. I checked twice. The boat is registered. It's not leaking. It's on wheels, and I move it every 72 hours like the law requires. The clubhouse wasn't booked when I placed it here, and every single person in this neighborhood with a cracked fence, mismatched blinds, or a busted porch light is just as non-compliant by your own rules. The only difference is, none of those things upset your sense of power. This boat did. He stepped back. That was it. No pleading, no counterattacks. Just the truth. Karen rose next. Her voice was syrupy, controlled, with that kind of theatrical restraint people use when trying to appear gracious while seething. Let me start by saying this isn't personal. We welcome every member of our community. But when one of us chooses to act outside the collective agreement we've nurtured for years, it undermines everything we stand for. This is about order, not emotion. She gestured dramatically toward the boat. This vessel is not only out of place, it is antagonistic. It was moved here not because there was no other option, but as a provocation. That name on the side isn't accidental. It's mockery. This isn't about maritime hobbies. This is about hostility. There were nods in the crowd. A few scattered hms. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Karen framed herself as the victim. Maybe it was how tired her argument sounded after weeks of escalating pettiness. One woman near the back, a quiet type Lewis only knew by sight, raised her hand. She didn't wait to be called on. I think we're going too far, she said. We've got worse issues. My neighbor hasn't trimmed his hedges in 6 months. My roof leaks every time it rains, and I still get letters about my mailbox paint. Maybe the boat isn't the problem. Karen blinked. With all due respect, this meeting is not about mailboxes. The woman folded her arms. Maybe it should be. There were murmurs again, but this time they weren't quite so uniform. Louis didn't smile, but he felt the shift in temperature. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a pressure in the other direction. After the meeting, no resolution was offered, no vote was taken. People filtered out, some slower than others, a few stopping near the boat, pretending to study the lettering like they were reading a menu, not a statement. Karen left without another word. The next day, someone egged his house. 3 hits, 1 on the garage door, 2 against the siding. Louis heard it around midnight, but by the time he got outside, the street was empty. No cars moving, no doors closing. Just silence and broken shells dripping down vinyl. He cleaned it up himself, didn't file a report, didn't take pictures. He knew the game now. They wanted him to escalate. They wanted him angry and loud so they could justify their harassment. Instead, he got up early and painted the garage door a shade darker than before. Not out of shame. Just because it made him feel clean again. That same weekend, Aaron came home with a detention slip. He'd gotten into a verbal altercation with another student who'd made a comment about living in a trailer park with a boat for a porch. It wasn't the insult that bothered Louis. It was the fact that Aaron, who rarely spoke at all, had finally cracked. They sat on the porch afterward, watching the street empty out as the sun set. "I'm not mad," Louis said, "but I want you to understand something. This whole thing, they're not scared of the boat. They're scared of what it means when someone doesn't play their game." Aaron nodded slowly. "So, what now?" Louis looked out toward the corner, where a set of new plastic cones had appeared near the community notice board. They weren't city-issued either. "Now we wait," he said. "They'll either push too far or trip on their own rules. Either way, we're not backing down." And they didn't. Not that night. Not the next. Because sometimes resistance isn't about shouting louder than your enemy. Sometimes it's just about standing your ground, while they waste all their energy trying to move you. It wasn't the sign that finally tipped things into absurdity. It was the way it was delivered. One morning, shortly after the community panel meeting that had ended in disarray, Louis opened his front door to find a neon orange plastic board duct taped to his mailbox. Mandatory Compliance Review. It read in bold block letters, with a subheading that claimed the Department of Visual Standards had flagged his property for intervention. It looked official at first glance, with a vaguely governmental seal printed in the corner, but on closer inspection, the seal was just an embossed clip art image of a handshake, and the letterhead included a Gmail address. The document had no legal weight, but it didn't need to. It was meant to look threatening enough to keep him on edge. Someone wanted him paranoid, unsettled, constantly second-guessing whether the next knock on the door would come with a fine or an order to remove the boat. He didn't react. He peeled the sign off slowly, folded it in half, and set it on his kitchen counter like a specimen. It was starting to get sloppy. That was a good sign. The more desperate they got, the more careless their moves became. 2 days later, things shifted in a more serious direction. Louis received an envelope from the actual city planning department. This one was typed cleanly, sent via registered mail, and signed by a real inspector. It was a formal notification of a pending code review, based on an anonymous complaint regarding improper storage of a non-operational vehicle. The letter gave him 10 business days to respond, stating that a city officer would be doing a visual inspection of his property during that period. There was no specific date or time, just a window. Louis set the envelope down and sighed. This wasn't some fake threat cobbled together in Karen's living room. This was real, even if it was born of the same pettiness. They had found a way to escalate it beyond neighborhood theater. Now the bureaucracy was involved, and even if they were wrong, he would need to jump through hoops to prove it. He immediately called his lawyer, the same one who had previously told him to document everything. She listened calmly, asked for a scan of the notice, and told him not to panic. "This is nuisance lawfare," she said. "They're weaponizing bureaucracy against you. But we've seen this before. As long as your documentation is solid, you'll be fine. Just don't miss anything." Louis nodded, already pulling up his receipts, his registration, his photos, the time-stamped emails confirming that the boat and trailer had up-to-date tags and had been relocated every required interval. He printed everything, sorted it into a binder, and tucked it inside his kitchen drawer. The next morning, he took it a step further. He called the city inspector directly, asked to clarify the scope of the review, and offered to be present during the walkthrough. The man on the phone sounded surprised. Most people didn't call first, but agreed to coordinate a date. "Honestly," the inspector said with a hint of fatigue, "this kind of complaint isn't uncommon in neighborhoods with hyperactive boards. You're not the first. Just have your paperwork ready, and we'll move through it fast." The walkthrough was scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the meantime, Karen wasn't done. Unable to stop the process she had set in motion, she pivoted her attention back to the court of public opinion. Flyers began appearing on doorsteps. Full color, printed on glossy stock with a photo of Louie's boat pasted next to a stock image of a rundown mobile home. The caption read, "Is this our future? Say no to neighborhood blight." No one signed the flyer, of course, but it didn't need a signature. The handwriting was all over it. One of the flyers even ended up under Lewis's windshield wiper while he was parked at the hardware store. He took it off, read it once, then calmly crumpled it and dropped it in a public trash can. He didn't need to take it home. The point had already been made. Aaron, meanwhile, was watching all of this unfold with a quiet tension that Lewis couldn't ignore. The boy said little, but the weight of what was happening was affecting him. At school, where his classmates parroted things they heard from their parents, and at home, where he had started asking more questions about why people cared so much about something that wasn't theirs. Lewis did his best to answer, always choosing words carefully. "People want control," he said one night as they fixed dinner. "And when they feel like they're losing it, they lash out at anything that reminds them they're not in charge." Aaron nodded, chewing silently on a piece of cornbread, then looked up and said, "You're not moving the boat, are you?" Louis shook his head. "Not unless they tow it. And even then, I'll make sure they regret it." Tuesday arrived, and with it came the city inspector. He was a middle-aged man in a polo shirt and khakis, clipboard in hand, polite but efficient. Lewis walked him around the property, answered every question, showed him the documents, the photographs, the tire rotation logs. The inspector didn't seem interested in finding a problem, just in checking off boxes. When they finished, he shook Louis's hand and said, "You're in the clear. Expect an official letter in the next few days." And that was that. But the very next morning, someone dumped a pile of gravel in Louis's driveway. Not a little, a full truckload, blocking the path. No note, no receipt, just a mountain of gray stone sitting where his truck would normally park. Louis stood there, hands on his hips, breathing in the cool morning air, and stared at it for a long time. This wasn't just another prank. It was obstruction, a message disguised as random misdelivery. He called the local gravel supplier, asked if any orders had come through in his name, and the woman on the phone checked the records. "Huh," she said. "Order placed online yesterday. Paid in cash. No name, but your address was listed. Can you tell who placed it?" "Not unless you want to subpoena the security footage." Lewis thanked her and hung up. Then he borrowed a wheelbarrow from a neighbor he barely spoke to, the one with the overgrown hedges and the faded Texas flag. The man nodded once, handed him the tool, and said, "You gonna need a shovel, too?" It was the first sign of support anyone had offered in days. Louis spent the afternoon moving the gravel by hand, creating a path through the mound just wide enough for his truck to pass. He didn't haul it all away. He left the rest stacked neatly along the edge of the property. When Karen passed by later that evening, walking her dog as if it were her kingdom she patrolled, she paused for a long moment in front of the house. Louis didn't wave. He just looked at her and said nothing. That night, he stood in the garage wiping sweat from his neck, and finally let the weariness catch up to him. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about who got to decide what was acceptable, about how easily order turned into control, and how quickly control became persecution when the wrong person refused to bend. He wasn't playing hero. He wasn't even playing rebel. He was just tired of the script, of watching the same people twist rules into weapons and call it civic duty. The gravel would get cleared eventually. But the fight was only beginning. The morning after the gravel incident, Louis awoke to the sound of measured footsteps on his porch and the sharp rustle of paper being tucked into the edge of his front door. By the time he pulled it open, whoever had left the envelope was already gone. The letter inside wasn't printed on city letterhead, nor typed with the neat formatting of the previous official notices. It was clearly a custom job, heavy stock, dark blue border, and embossed lettering that tried very hard to look important. At the top, it read, Community Corrective Action Notification. Beneath that, in a tone more rehearsed than legal, it stated that Lewis's ongoing visual obstruction had now been classified as a Level 2 involuntary nonconformity, and he would be subject to peer-administered resolution. He read it 3 times, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't believe how far they were willing to stretch the language of authority to mask what was essentially a vendetta. There was no citation of municipal code, no reference to zoning violations, just a collection of vaguely threatening phrases designed to sound like enforcement without actually carrying any weight. The signature at the bottom was new, not Karen, not one of the regulars. It was someone named Raymond L. Frickson, identified as Director of Visual Harmony. Louis stood in his foyer for a long moment, staring at the absurdity in his hands. And this wasn't just theater anymore. This was escalation under the mask of self-parody, and the terrifying part was that they were probably taking themselves seriously. He placed the letter on the dining table, poured himself coffee, and began drafting a response. Not because he felt the need to defend himself, but because he knew it was time to start treating this with the paper trail it deserved. The deeper it got, the more documentation he would need when the whole thing finally snapped. Later that afternoon, a set of metal barricades appeared around the community clubhouse. No explanation, no notice. Just a series of orange traffic barriers lined up in an awkward horseshoe pattern, as if cordoning off the boat like it was radioactive. The symbolism wasn't lost on Louis. Someone wanted to send the message that this space had become a hazard, an eyesore, a boundary too contaminated to approach. But it also told him something else. They were now spending money to maintain the illusion of control. Real money, rental fees, equipment, labor. He checked the city permit portal online and found no active permits issued for public obstruction. That meant these barricades had been set up without municipal approval, possibly by the same people who had ordered the gravel or who had printed the fake compliance notices. This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was coordinated, and likely bigger than just a handful of neighbors whispering in living rooms. Louis suspected that a few other property owners, likely the ones who saw themselves as protectors of the neighborhood's prestige, had joined in silently, perhaps financially, organizing beneath the surface to preserve what they imagined was their collective identity. What had begun as an attack from one woman now felt like a tightening grip from a faceless committee with too much time and an inflated sense of cultural stewardship. That evening, Louis decided to take a walk, just around the block, nothing conspicuous. As he passed by house after house, he noticed subtle changes that made him feel less like a neighbor and more like a marked man. Curtains shifted as he walked by. A car that had been parked for hours suddenly started and drove off slowly, only to loop back around 5 minutes later. Someone was watching him, tracking his movements as if he were the threat. At one corner, he saw a new camera installed just above the garage of a house that never used to have one, angled directly at his street. Another had a strange blinking sensor mounted under the eaves, too small to be a real security system, but obvious enough to send a message. Surveillance as performance. A neighborhood's idea of self-defense against the wrong kind of conformity. 3 days later, the boat was tagged. Not by the city, not by the police, but by someone who knew exactly how to mimic their format just well enough to fool the inattentive. A bright orange sticker affixed to the hull read, Notice of Removal, 72 hours. It looked almost legitimate, complete with a QR code and a forged reference number. Louis scanned the code with his phone. It led nowhere. The link was dead. Just a dummy site with no content. Whoever made it had put in the effort, but not enough to survive scrutiny. Still, to the average resident walking by, the message was clear. This boat is marked for removal. He left the sticker in place and taped a printed response beneath it. Illegal notice. Report filed. Then he made good on the statement by filing a formal complaint with the city clerk's office, including photos of the sticker, a copy of the fake letter, and a summary of recent events. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He didn't speculate. He just stated facts. The clerk, a tired woman in a gray cardigan, skimmed the documents and gave him a look that carried more sympathy than surprise. "You're not the first," she said quietly, handing him a stamped receipt. 2 days later, his mailbox was smashed in with a baseball bat. It happened at night, but not late enough to go unnoticed. Louis had been watching television in the living room when he heard the hollow metallic thud and the squeal of tires. He ran outside just in time to see a dark SUV turning the corner at the end of the street. The mailbox was twisted, the post splintered at the base. Mail was scattered across the lawn, bills and circulars fluttering in the wind like wounded birds. He stood there, barefoot on the concrete, and for the first time in weeks he felt the full weight of what they were trying to do. It wasn't just about pushing him out. It was about eroding him from the inside, stripping away every piece of normalcy until he either broke or disappeared. He didn't call the police. He replaced the post the next day, using a heavier model than before, one with a steel core and reinforced brackets. If they came back, they'd have to work harder. That night, he installed a private surveillance system, not because he was scared, but because he needed evidence. Not the grainy footage from someone else's ring cam. His own system. Quiet, legal, discreet. Cameras angled low and wide with time-stamped recordings and cloud storage. He didn't tell anyone. He just flipped the switch and left them running. Within 48 hours, he had footage. 3 men, hoodies, gloves. One held a bat. They weren't kids. Adults. Fast, organized, and methodical. Not drunk, not reckless. This was targeted. Louis made backup copies of the video and emailed them to his lawyer. Her response came back in minutes. "We're done playing nice. Time for formal action." She drafted a cease and desist letter, addressed not to Karen, but to the neighborhood board as a collective entity. She demanded an investigation into harassment, misuse of pseudo-authoritative materials, and potential incitement to vandalism. Attached were the photographs, the sticker, the forged notices, and now the video. The letter wasn't sent quietly. It was emailed. It was mailed. It was hand-delivered to the clubhouse by courier. A paper trail, undeniable and confrontational. The response came quicker than Louis expected. Within a week, he received a formal letter from a real legal representative hired by the board. It didn't deny the events. It didn't even address most of the accusations. Instead, it danced in place, citing conflicting narratives and community tensions exacerbated by confrontational behaviors. It hinted that both parties had contributed to the breakdown in decorum and strongly recommended mediation. Louis declined. He knew what mediation meant. It meant compromise disguised as resolution. It meant giving ground to people who hadn't earned it. Instead, he directed his lawyer to begin preparing for formal complaint filings, not just against the board, but against the individuals responsible for targeted harassment, if identities could be proven. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast. But it would be real. That evening, as he reviewed the footage again, Louis felt no anger, only clarity. They had turned this into war, but he hadn't fired the first shot. All he did was park a boat. It wasn't the letter from the city that set the final match to the powder keg. It was the silence that followed it. After weeks of mounting pressure, nightly sabotage, forged notices, and escalating psychological warfare disguised as community enforcement, Louis received a formal written response to his complaint. It was brief, almost clinical. The city acknowledged receipt of his evidence, confirmed that an investigation into unauthorized use of regulatory signage and impersonation of code enforcement was underway, and advised him that further inquiries might require in-person testimony. That was it. No timeline, no commitment, just process. But it was enough to make something shift behind the scenes, because within 2 days of that letter arriving, the neighborhood changed. The tone, the posture, the choreography of it all. People who had once stared him down now avoided eye contact entirely. Conversations at driveways grew shorter, more guarded. The rhythm of the place, the aggressive landscaping, the constant car polishing, the empty performative wave at the mailboxes, slowed like a machine beginning to wind down. Lewis recognized it for what it was, the moment just before denial collapses into consequence. That weekend, an emergency meeting of the community board was scheduled. The notice was sent late Friday night, far too quickly for such a gathering to be standard. The email was signed not by Karen, but by a new name, Interim Compliance Coordinator, Vincent Burlow. No explanation for the title change, no mention of Karen's role. Lewis didn't attend the meeting, but he knew what it meant. Somewhere between the lawyer's letter, the surveillance footage, and the whispers that had begun to circulate among the more reasonable residents, something had snapped. The carefully curated facade of control had fractured just enough for light to bleed in. But that didn't mean the fight was over. It meant those with something to lose were about to double down. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled up across the street from Louis's house. Not the one from the mailbox incident. This one was newer, polished to a shine, with tinted windows and chrome trim. A man in a gray suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, no name tag. He approached slowly, like someone trained to appear calm while calculating the layout of a room. Louis met him on the porch, arms crossed. "Mr. McCoy," the man began, voice smooth and practiced. "I'm here on behalf of the Neighborhood Administrative Mediation Committee." "That's not a real government entity," Louis said flatly. The man smiled without warmth. "No, sir. It's a private coalition formed to address complex conflicts between residents and residential boards. We believe this situation has gone on long enough. Our hope is to bring closure in a way that prevents legal escalation." Lewis didn't respond. "We're authorized," the man continued, "to offer you a resolution package, financial compensation in exchange for permanent relocation of your vessel, and a signed agreement of non-disparagement. No admission of fault, just closure." Lewis looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You offering me a payoff to shut up and go away?" "Think of it," the man replied, "as a professional courtesy to avoid what could become a very long, very public process." Louis smiled, a small exhausted thing. "That's the problem," he said. "You all thought this was about the boat." And then he closed the door. The next night, just after midnight, the alarms went off. Not the security system, the cameras. The ones he had installed after the mailbox, after the gravel, after the sticker. A motion alert pinged his phone. He looked at the screen and saw 3 figures moving across the lot near the clubhouse, circling the boat. One carried a backpack, another a long object. Metal, thin, probably a crowbar or pipe. Lewis didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, stepped into his truck, and drove down the street, lights off. He turned the corner quietly and coasted into view of the lot just as one of the men was trying to wedge something between the trailer's frame and hitch. They froze when they saw his headlights. One ran immediately. The others hesitated, then bolted as Louis stepped out of the cab, phone already filming, voice calm. "Keep running," he said loud enough to carry. "Your faces are already saved." They disappeared into the dark, but it didn't matter. The camera footage was clear, full view, and this time, one of them had left behind a tool bag, stupidly dropped in the rush to escape. Inside were wire cutters, gloves, and, most importantly, a keycard labeled CSAC Visitor, temporary access. The same acronym used in the fake committee name on the man's clipboard. Louis didn't wait until morning. He sent the footage and images of the badge to his lawyer, who immediately forwarded them to the police. It was no longer vandalism. It was attempted theft, and it was organized. Within 48 hours, detectives showed up, not in patrol cars, but in plain vehicles, taking statements not just from Louis, but from several neighbors who had also begun to report strange visits, forged notices, and pressure to sign. Confidentiality documents. The story was unraveling faster than anyone could manage. Then came the news. Karen Holbridge had resigned. Not just from her position on the board, but from the neighborhood entirely. Her home, once the nucleus of whisper campaigns and passive-aggressive scheming, went dark overnight. A "for sale by owner" sign appeared in her yard 3 days later, followed by a hastily scrubbed online listing that described the house as a peaceful retreat in a harmonious community. It didn't mention the lawsuits. Within the week, the barricades around the clubhouse disappeared. The flyers stopped. The neighborhood chat fell silent, then reopened with a message from one of the junior board members. "We'd like to move forward with a renewed commitment to transparency and mutual respect." No one mentioned the boat. No one dared. Louis left it there another week, just to prove the point. Then, on a Saturday morning, with the sun hanging low and stillness in the air, he hitched the trailer to his truck and slowly rolled it back to his property. No words, no banners, no grand gesture. The lettering on the side still read, "The HOA Eyesore." He didn't repaint it. He didn't need to. The following weeks unfolded with an almost eerie quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind born from exhaustion, from embarrassment, from the slow crumbling of a collective lie that had propped itself up on too many unwritten rules and whispered threats. The neighborhood, once abuzz with perfectly synchronized sprinkler systems and the hum of obsessive lawn maintenance, seemed to exhale all at once, as though the tension that had once gripped every hedge and every porch light had finally lost its grip. Karen's house stood empty now, blinds drawn, driveway vacant. The "for sale" sign remained, weathered by recent rain, and no one dared to touch it. People passed it quickly, eyes averted, as if guilt could stain the skin through eye contact. Louis noticed these things, not out of spite, but because he understood what they meant. It wasn't about victory, not really. It was about the uneasy aftertaste of a war that never needed to happen. The boat, now back in its original spot beside the house, sat as it had always sat. Quiet, still, weathered, but whole. The lettering remained untouched. The HOA Eyesore had in a strange way become more than a jab. It was a relic now, a symbol of something that had dared to push back. Louis had considered painting over it once the dust had settled, but something about the name felt earned. Not defiant anymore, but historical. Like a scar you don't cover because it reminds you that healing is possible. People began to approach him again. Slowly, awkwardly. The man with the broken fence asked about boat trailers. A woman whose dog used to bark at the mailman stopped during her walk and commented on the weather. One day, the same guy who had lent him the wheelbarrow came by to return it again, though Louis hadn't realized he'd taken it back. He just left it on the porch with a folded note tucked into the handle that read, "You were right not to back down. Some of us just needed more time to get there." Louis didn't reply. He didn't need to. The message wasn't about reconciliation. It was about recognition. And recognition, earned honestly, doesn't need acknowledgement to be real. Aaron seemed lighter too. The boy, who had once watched from the window with narrowed eyes and clenched fists, now asked questions like, "When are we fixing the stern rail?" Or, "Could we maybe paint the interior?" They worked on the boat together some evenings, side by side, not always talking but always moving. It became less a monument to conflict, and more a shared space of calm, something shaped not by pressure but by patience. Louis didn't teach in the traditional sense. He didn't explain every tool or every step. He just showed the way, and Aaron picked it up, the way kids do when they finally feel like they're on solid ground. The neighborhood board, now led by someone younger, quieter, and less interested in authoritarian theatrics, sent out a revised community standards packet. It was simple, straightforward, and, most importantly, voluntary. The language was softer. The formatting lacked the veiled threats. There were no capitalized mandates or passive-aggressive phrasing, just a collection of suggestions, drafted with the tone of people who had finally understood the difference between unity and uniformity. Louis read it once, nodded, and slid it into the drawer with the rest of the documents that had once fueled a campaign against him. He didn't throw them away. He believed in records. Records were how you proved to yourself, years later, that you weren't just imagining how hard things got. One Sunday morning, a small group of residents hosted a cookout in the cul-de-sac. Nothing formal, nothing branded. Just folding chairs, cheap burgers, mismatched drinks in plastic cups, and the sound of people relearning how to talk without subtext. Someone invited Louis and Aaron without pressure, just a nod and a "we'll have extra." They showed up late, stayed just long enough to eat and share a few words, then left when the sun dipped low. No one asked about the boat. No one mentioned what had happened. And that, Louis thought, was maybe the closest thing to an apology he would ever get. That night, as he stood in the driveway watching the porch lights flicker on one by one down the street, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but equilibrium. The kind of quiet that settles not when everyone agrees, but when people finally stop pretending they have to. The kind of balance that doesn't need control to survive. He turned back toward the boat and ran his hand along the hull. The paint was chipping a little near the name. He thought about fixing it, then decided against it. Let it wear. Let it age. Let it remind.